Well, my name is Maisa Tisdale, and I'm the president of the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center in Bridgeport. And I have the honor today of introducing Keith Stokes. So, let me tell a little story. I believe that way back when, in the early days of creation, that there were little gifts planned for those of us living in certain times. Because you see, some people are gifted, and some people are gifts. And I see these beings, and they're saying, oh, we've got a great surprise for the folks living in New England about this time and about this place. Now, in this package, we're going to put really sharp intellect, research skills. We're going to put empathy and someone who understands how to bring people together because he understands their cultures and he understands what's the same and he values what's different. And this person will be an awesome researcher and scholar, but you know what? Sometimes those scholars are a little bit dry. This person will have the ability to make people smile and laugh and feel appreciated. And we're going to put this package together, and we're going to leave it on the doorstep of appreciative people who want to do the same thing. I am introducing Keith Stokes. He's not just gifted, he's a gift. And you're about to find that out. So, I'll tell you a little bit about him. He's a native of Newport, Rhode Island, and he's a resident there. He's the vice president of the 1696 Heritage Group. Mr. Stokes, Keith Stokes, he served on regional and national historic preservation boards, including Rhode Island advisor for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He's a chairman of the Turrell Synagogue Foundation and a vice president and trustee of the Preservation Society for Newport County, and advisor for the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. He's also a board member of Newport Historical Society. He's a grad of Cornell University. Those of us who went to other Ivy League schools will not hold that against him. And the University of Chicago. He's a lecturer, and not just in preservation, but also in community and regional planning. And his expertise, it spans from African and Jewish American history. And he's also working on a documentary that tells the history of his family coming from West Africa to the Americas. So I'm not going to hang on and tell too many of his praises, except that I never even knew he worked for ASTA, the American Sail Training Association. I'm an old deckhand from tall ships, and so I'm really impressed by that. But he's been honored by the NAACP and by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And so you can tell that he has a lot of stories to tell us and a lot of expertise to impart. So, with no further ado, Mr. Keith Stokes.
Maisa. Sometimes my kids sit in on my lectures, and when I get these long introductions, they just bring me back to earth by reminding me, saying, geez, Dad, you're old. You've been around a long time. And I have been a long time. I've spent about the last 30 years of my career involved in everything from community sustainability, economic development, historic interpretation, preservation. And when Maisa had reached out to me to come back to Connecticut, I have some ancestors who were born right here in Bridgeport, area of Fairfield County. I had told her I had delivered a presentation with the National Trust. I do a lot of work with them on teaching old sites new tricks. And this was delivered about 10 years ago, as we were all still reeling from the tragic events of 9/11 and the impact it had on historic museum homes, particularly smaller attractions. How do we continue to sustain ourselves and attract visitors and maintain a creative experience? So a portion of this presentation was tied to that, but But what I also wanted to do was provide a presentation to really tip a hat to artists. As someone who can't write or can't paint or can't dance or can't sing, I've embraced myself by surrounding myself with very creative people. I've married a very creative woman. And I've also been very fortunate to the fact that much of the work that I've done have been able to deploy the skills and the artistic talents of artists in adaptive reuse of buildings, main streets within communities, historic interpretations of ethnic organizations, institutions. So what I wanted to do today was to kind of quickly run through why I think the art of storytelling is so important in not only presenting a place or a people or a history or an opportunity, but it also becomes very, in fact, that a good story really engages your audience, which could be a funder, it could be a visitor, it could be a friend, or it could be a potential ally. Good storytelling is very much a part of that. And in fact, in most of my career of what we call today kind of creative placemaking, all of it is really tied into the stories of how we present that place. And the model I'm going to use is the National Trust model because I've been very involved with the National Trust for most of my career. I've been their advisor for almost 20 years for the state of Rhode Island. Then I've been actively involved as an advisor working with them on African American and African American experience and interpretation. Particularly here in New England, which, again, just kind of a pitch for New England, some of the oldest and richest and deepest African heritage history in America started right here between Connecticut, Rhode Island, into Massachusetts. It's right here. It just needs to be interpreted and unveiled. So following a national trust model, which, again, is one I think is quite effective, it really helps us to understand the fact that as we begin to develop this new industry called heritage and cultural tourism, and what is heritage and cultural tourism? It's simply interpreting a visitor experience from the arts, from the history, from the very community values itself. And what we have found by analyzing the economic value of heritage tourism, people who are that heritage tourism visitor, they tend to spend more time and more money. So the hotels and the tourism operators and hospitality community like more time and more money. So heritage tourism is really, I believe, an untapped resource of building sustainability and not only maintaining communities' historic structures, but most importantly, being able to provide a unique and dynamic and welcoming experience. And we tell those stories in many different ways. And again, as you see from docent tours, lectures, displays, websites, podcasts, I'm going to really focus on 5 examples that I've had experience in, bringing from concept to implementation to now sustained programs. And I'm going to really focus on some of the tricks that I've used or I've been involved in working with the artist community, both professional and amateur artists, and be able to tell that story, present that case, be able to build that program. So very much focused around the planning charrette process, the visual arts and how we interpret, historic structure restorations, and even in Main Street planning. In each and every case of these 5 examples, you will see where we've worked actively within the artist community. In fact, much of the grants, the research planning grants I've been able to tie into, have worked with state and regional humanities committees and arts councils. I mean, what a resource they are in getting that seed money to get things off the ground, particularly for nonprofit, small organizations. So, again, kudos to the Alliance here in Fairfield County. The first story I want to tell is Turrell Synagogue, and this is close to me because my maternal grandfather was born here in Bridgeport via Africa and Jamaica, but my maternal grandmother is a part of the Sephardic Jewish families and direct line of Turrell Synagogue, the early Jews of New York and Newport. So a very interested blended family. We've been blended since about 1670 in America. But in any case, I've been on the board and I've been chairman of the board of Turrell Synagogue for the past 25 years. If you haven't, we urge that you visit. Turrell Synagogue to date is the oldest existing Jewish synagogue and place of worship in North America. It was completed and dedicated on December 2nd for Hanukkah in 1763. It's a remarkable asset. But one of the challenges that we had with this synagogue is it's still an active place of worship. It still operates as an active place for men, women, and families to worship God. So the challenge of having visitors, we were ballooning up to about 100,000 visitors a year and managing that visitor experience, but also managing the experience and protecting the sanctity of the people who worship there. So we were very fortunate between 2004 and 2008 when we completed it, and we raised about $10 million to build a visitor center on the grounds of the synagogue. As we built the visitor center, and it's a very smart center. It's got all the bells and whistles and kiosks and such. We also found that we needed to build something a little bit more sustainable and dynamic. So we began to establish an education committee and a creative arts committee that would begin to build programming not only within the synagogue and the visitor center, but to create this compelling experience so visitors to our synagogue would want to spend more time and more money and more contribution and support. So today, 10 years later, we've been able to build a robust series of programs around that visitor center. The visitor center is the place, but the activity, the soul of our programming comes from our events and activities. And we have a beautifully designed park called Patriots Park in recognition of the Jewish patriots of the colonial America. It's a great place where there's lots of seating, lots of shade. So it's a place where people can reflect, can take wonderful photographs, or sometimes just stop and rest in their travails. We also established a Jewish colonial walking tour, so we connected the synagogue with larger Newport. We actually brought in researchers and architects, and we found, again, Newport, like many old New England communities, we had about 35 structures where Jews lived, worked, and worshiped that predated the synagogue itself. So this now Jewish walking tour has become one of the most popular elements for people who can now explore the larger community and interact within the synagogue. We also established a Latino music concert. The Jews that settled in early America were Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, not to give you a lecture, but a little bit different from many of the Jews today in America who trace themselves to Eastern Europe, Ashkenazi Jews. These Sephardic Jews, who many originated from Spain and Portugal, their first language was Spanish. In fact, many of our Hebrew Bibles that we still contain in the synagogue are in Spanish, some in Portuguese. So one of the things that we found is that the Latino people, the Latino culture, had a significant series of art, music, foodstuffs that we now brought to life. So now we have a Latino music festival that draws people from all around the northeastern country. We have a Ladino food festival in preparing food from 200 to 300 years ago. And again, another unique way to create this compelling, interesting, unique visitor experience, because again, we want to get people to spend more time, spend more money. That's good. And we also have each year a lecture series. We have a George Washington annual lecture series, which has really grown. I give great kudos to the congregation because we've had 2 sitting Supreme Court jurists. We've had some of the most spectacular speakers come and talk a little bit about the meaning of religious freedom. And particularly in these days, the issues of freedom and early immigration become very relevant to the population. Today, that visitor center, that building, has become a hub of a number of external activities that include the larger Newport community, but most importantly, the artistic community and the cultural community of Newport in the larger region. The second model is wayfaring and signage, and how do you get people around your community? And one of the things we did about 15 years ago, I put together a committee that was made up of the leading institutions in Newport, our hospital, our college, our war college, the city itself, and we brought a number of artists in, and we decided that we needed to create kind of a signage program within the city, but we just didn't want plain old green or blue signs. We wanted something that would fit the character of the community, and if it stood before a historic structure, that it would be able to frame that structure in a proper way and not give an institutional, unwelcome feeling. So we put out an RFQ, request for qualifications, and we ended up engaging John Roll and Baresi Associates out of Cambridge. Great firm, did a great job for us. They've done work from the Freedom Trail in Boston to Harvard and other types of programs. But most importantly, we spent 2 days designing and developing through the direct input of the larger Newport community. We had what was called a planning charrette. I'm sure most of you know what a planning charrette process is, but very succinctly, it brings everybody and anybody in the kitchen sink to bring in their ideas and their concepts of what a sign should be, what it should look like, how it should be inscribed, where it should be placed, how it should be maintained. And we had several hundred people participate over a 2-day period. And what the outcome of that was an entire sign implementation program for the city. In fact, we selected Newport, Rhode Island, a sailing ship, which is very much the identity of Newport, like most of New England. We came up with code systems, color code systems. We came up with ADA, American Disability Act requirements, where some signs are set up as sign kiosks in different public park or public areas, so that people who may be wheelchair bound can come up to the sign in a map kiosk and then interact with where they want to go, how they want to interact within the community. We've set it up as an online system, and now it's something that's being duplicated by a number of communities. But what really made it work was having the people come together to buy into it and support this. And most importantly, the artist community, where all the artwork that you see was all recommendations from local artists. We also were very much involved in Main Street work. I've consulted around the country on a number of small Main Street projects, particularly on the sustainability aspect of it. And in Newport, we kicked off one almost 20 years ago. Only last year did we complete some of the physical improvements of our Main Street. But again, through a planning charrette process, which was quite exciting, was the fact is we could design a functional, safe, and dynamic Main Street. But what made it really work was the artist community. One of the things that I was a little bit frustrated when we began to talk about things such as signage and street furniture. Street furniture could be anything from benches and such, flower pots. I was getting a little bit concerned that some of the municipal officials were going to kind of go online and order from some of these stock programs. And my recommendation was, well, why don't we go to the artist community? Because what I don't want in Newport, which I think we're a pretty historic, significant community, is what I kind of coin ye old sign. I just didn't want that, you know, welcome to Newport sign or happy holiday sign that you can buy online. I wanted something a little bit more creative. And what we ended up doing is we worked with the sailing community, who basically gave us sailing material, and we had artists come in and create their own temporary signs, and eventually those were built into permanent signage within the community. And it was eclectic, it was funky. A tattoo shop put up a sign of tattoo imagery. That was tough for the old guard, but they had to understand that Newport and Broadway was both a blending of old and new. What really made Broadway come to life was the fact that we also, through several grants, one through the National Trust, the second supported by 2 of our local banks, we went to every small business and suggested that if they would like to create a new frontage, a new storefront, a new appearance, we'll do 2 things. We will fund up to 50% of $10,000 commitment that you would make as a grant, but we will also underwrite several local architects and artists who will work with you and help you come up with your unique design standards. So again, this was really neat. Instead of having a ye old awning and the signs and such, no fiberglass, no vinyl, we actually got the artist community and architects working with every individual business owner. We ended up doing 100 businesses over a 10-year period. And it's interesting and it's eclectic, and each person has their own identity. And we were able to use, going forward, the city was so excited, they used federal community development block grant money to further underwrite some of the storefront improvements going forward. So again, just this little bit of kind of a unique way of how we might finance and develop this, but more importantly, it's bringing the artist community in. It creates just a level of energy and uniqueness and interest that you normally wouldn't have sometimes in Main Street programs. One of the greatest challenges that we had in most Main Streets, but we had even in our Main Street in Newport, was sustainability. So about 4 years ago, the city manager took me out to lunch and said, you know, we have a school coming online on Broadway, where our Main Street is. It's about 33,000 square feet, 3.5 stories. We like to do something with it. And like most of our former schools, we can make it into condos, because there's a great man for condos, or senior housing or something like that. And I said, geez, boy, no more condos. You know, we need to do something on Broadway that connects it to really the 21st century and the new economy. We've got to do something where 50 years from now, Broadway is still a hopping place. There's still people dining and hanging out there and doing things. So we sat down and we talked it through, and then I put together a grant application through the U.S. Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration, and I've done lots of work with them. And I brought together several good friends of mine, particularly Northeast Collaborative Architects, who have offices here in Connecticut, Middletown, and Newport. We've done work, and my suggestion was, why don't we kind of create more of an incubator space or a co-work space, or something that can bring talented people together in a cost-effective way, kind of a gathering place. Because if you understand the concepts of main streets and town centers, particularly in New England, it's very much centered around a town center. And that town center has your market, your meeting place, your government center. And we wanted to create something like that for Broadway. So with our grant application, we submitted it. We were successful. We had great support from our congressional delegation. And we created the concept which became Innovate Newport. Innovate Newport is breaking ground next month. It's a $6.9 million co-work space. We were able to work with artists in Massachusetts. In fact, we went to Cambridge, to Kendall Square, and we had the head of the Kendall Square Development Association, Artist Association come down and work with us. We stole a lot of his great ideas. In fact, we've used one of his interior architects to do the design work, and this will become a 33,000 square foot co-work space that will allow for moderately priced memberships for entrepreneurs in the areas of ocean engineering, undersea technology, and related technology work within the area. We're projecting that there'll be about 500 members in the first 3 years of this program. Just the demand that we've had has been substantial. The key for that is those 500 members coming in and out of that space 24/7, 365 days a year. They're going to be dining, they're going to be shopping, they're going to be interacting in that Broadway Main Street area. We didn't want to put it in the suburbs, we didn't want to put it in the tech park. We wanted to put it right within the density where people live, work, worship, and play and have fun, and all connected there. So we're very, very proud of that. As you can see in the bottom, your right-hand corner, we even brought an artist in to do some renditions on how it might look as we were pitching it to different funders and supporters. This story is very close to my heart because it's very much tied to much of the African-American history work that I've been able to do across the country and even in the West Indies. Newport, Rhode Island, we have a lot of old everything, but one of the most sacred places that we have is we have the oldest existing African burying ground in North America. And it dates back to 1705. We have recovered and restored, and we're still in the process of restoring about 250 markers. Most of those markers from the 18th century. The earliest marker that has been preserved dates back to 1710. Most importantly, by 1780, the African community, very similar to the African community here in Connecticut at Hartford at the ancient burying ground, they began to plan out their own burials, and they actually hired their own stonemasons to carve the information in the images on these markers. So to this day, this burying ground has some of the most earliest artwork of African artists that are carved in the 18th century. And just some of the markers, as you can see in the stonework, is quite magnificent. In fact, even some of the cherubs or the angels are carved with African features, which is unique and which you will not see anywhere where Africans were enslaved or free in early America. So this cemetery has become a very special place. And in fact, we've spent a lot of time not only restoring the cemetery, but interpreting the cemetery. And the section where the African burying ground is in was begun to be called God's Little Acre by about the mid-19th century. By the 1850s and 60s, the African-American community in Newport were calling it God's Little Acre. It became a very important place for them. As we were restoring the cemetery, we had lots of discussions over the fact of, if we restore it and we have lots of people visiting it, is that really what we want? Do we want lots of people walking through a cemetery, standing on markers? Please don't stone rub. That's a bad thing for slate markers. It puts artificial materials on the surface. You're leaning on the surface. It's not the best thing to do. So we had a lot of discussions about how do we present this cemetery. Well, we created a website. We digitized all the markers so people can go online and learn the history and such. But we also wanted to create a more dynamic space for events because it's not only a cemetery, it's a public place. It's a place that should be used by the broader public for their value of history and learning. So again, as we were starting to design the interpretation part of the cemetery, I went back into the artist community. In fact, I went to a local artist and challenged him. I want to create a sign, but I just don't want a plastic sign next to 18th century slate stones. I want something that's interpretive and meaningful. And this wonderful artist sat with me and said, well, first of all, Keith, I'm a white guy. I don't know anything about slavery or Africans or African Americans. Tell me a little bit about them. Take me to the cemetery. So we spent hours and hours walking through the cemetery. He got on his hands and knees. He took photos of every marker and such, and he finally came up with a marker of a little boy named Solomon Nubatike, who died at the age of 5, and said, that's it. That's what we're going to build this sign around. And he hand-carved the head cap to the sign of God's Little Acre with the image, the cherub image of Solomon Nubatike. We also talked about the fact that here in New England, particularly New London, Newport, Boston, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the sailing merchants who were quite proud of their African trade, West Indian trade, would bring back a lot of exotic fruit. And in fact, in many of the door jambs and door head caps of colonial homes, you'll see pineapples in different symbols of that prosperity. So we placed pineapples at the top of the. We also understood that as a part of the slave trade, many of the Africans arrived, chained, and enslaved. So we used actually iron that we received from Ghana, which was tied very much to the Gold Coast and the England trade, to build this sign. So this sign has become a work of art, in an interpretive work of art. And we've added sayings from Ghana and sayings from Nigeria on the sign, so when people come, they have an ability to really understand the sacred nature and the important nature and the history of this place through this single sign. We've also run events into the cemetery in God's Little Acre. We've had a number of African chiefs. We have a large group of Nigerian chiefs coming in April, and they've had libation and other ceremonies so they could reconnect their ancestors who were once thought lost in America and now reconnected back. And these ceremonies are quite chilling, because it's literally people coming and blessing the sacred ground of ancestors that they thought were lost 2 and 3 centuries before. We've also worked very closely with the art community. Newport Art House is a great group of young guys and gals who do artistic expressions and programs across the city. And we sat with them and had a long discussion about what we could do in the cemetery. And several of them who were with the Newport Ballet decided to have a dance program in recognition and interpretation of early colonial women and the trials and tribulation that they had gone through in that cemetery and in the community. We also used them in coming up with several artistic programs, photograph exhibits, and now the cemetery has become a quite popular place for artists. I always like it as a place where I can kind of sit and reflect a bit and kind of have a better understanding of the community that I live in. So I want to stop here because I'm very mindful of the clock, but I wanted to do something for you that would give you how I think it's really important to use art, the visual arts, the written arts, to connect with history and preservation. And I wanted to do it here with the cemetery. As I said, our cemetery dates back to 1705. It's the largest intact existing African burying ground in America. About half of the markers that are there are children. There are a number of African children who died at a very young age, as all children in the community, from pestilence, from disease. But I wanted to connect you with a way of looking at the cemetery through a visualization of the markers of about 12 African children, half enslaved, half free. But as I try to remind audiences when we talk about the history of Africans in America and New England, we're not talking about slaves. These were flesh and blood men, women, and children who were enslaved. And when you see this presentation, we're going to connect you with a marker of a child. We're going to give you an image of what an African child at that age today would have looked like. So you're not looking at a marker of a long-lost ghost of the historical past. You're looking at someone's beloved son, daughter, child, grandchild, who died tragically in 1705 or 1755.
You're broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round, and you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Move mountains, we gon' walk it out and move mountains. And I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up, I like the waves. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. The silence isn't quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take the world to its feet. Move mountains, bring it to its feet. Move that we have each other. And we will rise, we will rise, we'll rise. Oh, we'll rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day. I'll rise up in spite of the ache. I will rise 1,000 times again, and we'll rise up. I like the waves. We'll rise up in spite of the ache. We'll rise up, and we'll do it 1,000 times again. Thank you for taking me out.
Now, don't you want to go to that cemetery? And isn't African American history neat? Again, in presenting a very difficult story, a challenging story, a very emotional story for many of us, by using the visual arts and using the arts, you have a platform to share an experience that engages a wider population and gets them to spend more time and more money in your community, in your event. So thank you for having me, and I don't know if I have, David, if you answer any questions I might have, but I'm sensitive to time. But thank you very much.
First of all, that was stunning. Thank you for showing that. As a community, how do you encourage the so-called old guard to embrace innovation and change?
Yeah, the question is, how do you embrace the old guard? The old guard could be a number of different audiences. It could be the political system, the government system. It could be some of the older lending institutions and business institutions, or a combination. That's where, from my own experience and those that I've worked with, is utilizing some of the seed dollars coming from humanities committees and arts councils and the like, whereas you really kind of provide things in very small spoonfuls. You really develop an initial program, an introduction, you meet with them, you present the case, and then from there you build towards a larger system. I think sometimes, in what I've found, in particularly historic preservation, there's always this sense that the preservation should start from the most important story, the most important people. From my experience, that tends to be that white male European Anglo-Protestant, and that's really something I've not really worked much in most of my career. So I have found myself, interacting with business organizations, with corporate sponsorship, foundations nationally and such, by providing, very short tidbits of what could be there, what could be available, what might be done. I mean, this little kind of vignette with the children and the markers has become a very powerful piece that my wife and others have used at the State Black Heritage Society to build some real momentum around the importance of African American history. In fact, there were no slaves in those images. Those were beautiful children that were beloved by very much the marker that was given to them. So I always suggest to people, and as I work with lots of clients, you start small. And you really create a compelling message based upon what you have, and then you take that step by step by step. It's hard work. I don't have to tell most of you here in this room. I mean, our Main Street program in Newport that's culminated in Innovate Newport's is 20 years. The work that we're doing on the cemetery will continue to work forever, but it's been 20 plus years of work. So it takes the time and dedication that's required. My other point that I would also make is diversify yourselves. I mean, again, as someone who's got no artistic skills. It's really a treat for me to surround myself with different artists. And I'm learning that coming from the old school, for me, when I think of an artist, it's someone who paints. Now, the digital arts have opened up a whole new world, both in technology and application and interpretation, as I'm now working with digital artists on different aspects of historic preservation. So it takes the time it takes, but it can happen.
Yeah, thank you again for your presentation. I'm working with this group in Stamford called Everyday Democracy, which is dedicated to addressing racial inequities in Stamford. And we talked about progress, like racial equity progress over the years and if there has been any. And one of the people in our group said that there has not been any, and it's just injustice is more insidious now. There are more clear ways. And so I'm wondering, since storytelling and art has such a great impact, if you've had examples of using the impact of storytelling work to make a real difference and a call to action for communities to further the justice of people who are still working.
No, that's a great question. And my kids particularly get after me because they want me to be more socially conscious and relevant and politically relevant to issues of today. My general sense in the work that I've done over the years is, in speaking from a single person of African American heritage, I can't speak for a community, the greatest challenge that we face today and going forward is less overt racism, because you could see it, you could feel it, you could touch it, and then you have to deal with it. It's less racism, but more invisibility. It's the fact that who we are as a people, past, present, and future, just doesn't resonate. It doesn't count. My wife's family is from Guatemala and then Spain, and she always reminds me to the fact that, you know, we need to do more to bring to the attention of people in our community, in our state, in our nation, that black and brown people count too. And I think it's the visual arts. I think it's historic preservation, which I've been immersed in, that can do that. In fact, I think you've got one of the best programs right here with Maisa Tisdale in the Eliza Freeman House, because you've got the ability to not only recreate a community, but you could begin to tell a story about the men, the women, and families that lived there that didn't necessarily look like George and Martha Washington. I mean, I've spent most of my career interpreting the histories of people who are not the founding fathers of America. They have been the minority religion or ethnic group or racial group. But what I've also found is that when you present that story to those populations, the light bulb comes up, the excitement they get. Because all of a sudden, we're not talking to African communities from a perspective of chattel property. We're talking to African communities from the perspective of fellow African heritage human beings. And I think it's the visual arts that can create the most stunning and the most effective presentation in that. The other reality is the audience. And I've mentioned this to Kathy. Lisa, we talk about this. By 2050, the majority of the population in this country is going to be brown. That's your visitor experience. That's your customer. That's your payer. That's your contributor. That's your student. That's your neighbor is going to look less and less like George and Martha Washington and more like the people of color in your community. So I think the challenge is through the arts, through education, through the literary community, is to bring to life, to make us less invisible, to make us clearly visible. Because the more visible we are, the more interactive we can be in the larger community. That's my take on it. It's not as radical as my daughters would like me to be, but it's kind of who I am as a kind of an old dad type. We know that.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
Keith.
very much.
Yes, join me in welcoming. Thank you so much. Really hit a chord, I think.